Okay, I start the recording now with a slight delay, but to this point, I only made announcements. So the people who will watch the record haven't lost anything in terms of content. Now, we are resuming the discussion of the grid divergence. What it means, the opening of what were previously closed words. Well, this is something which originally has only a very limited impact or significance in quantitative terms, right? We are not talking about a lot of goods which start to move along the Atlantic trade routes from, say, the beginning of the 16th century. It starts very slow. Now, to understand this, we maybe have to think a little bit better at how a pre-industrial agrarian society functions, right? Think about the Mediterranean societies or the European societies from before the opening of the Atlantic trade routes. A very simple scheme is the one which you find in the board here, and then I will take a picture at the end of class as usual. Think that about 90% of what is produced, and that's mostly agrarian product in this context, right, is produced and consumed locally, generally speaking, in a rural village, which is where the vast majority of the population lived. Only something is sold on the market of reference, which basically means in the closest city, right? So there are some products which are produced in the city. There are people who come from rural areas to the city on the market day to acquire the products that they can produce on their own, for example, iron tools, right? And they will also sell part of their produce on the market of the city. Let's say about 9% of the total. It's not a matter it was 8.5 or 9.2, doesn't matter. It's an order of magnitude, okay? And then, beyond this, there is maybe 1% of the product which is sold internationally. So this exists even the boundary of states or of polities more generally. This might be city-states, this might be something closer to what you would call a state today. How you can estimate this? Well, this is basically the percentage of the grain production in the Mediterranean which is exported by ship. So 1%. You can imagine this also spatially. This means what? That you have circles which include each other. Okay, so you have first very small circles. These are the villages. Okay, within a village, 90% of what is produced is consumed here. Then you have a city. And this is the circle representing the market of reference. But you will have other things like this, okay? Another cluster of villages with another city around this. And then you will have a larger circle which includes this. And you might even consider that this is, for example, the world economy of reference, right? So 1% of the total product is distributed across the world economy, so across the Mediterranean, for example, or exported from the Mediterranean area to the Baltic, or vice versa, of course, like English wool being sent from England to the Low Countries or to Florence even, where then it is transformed into high-quality textiles, about 1% of the total. Now, let's think that this is kind of the Mediterranean world economy. And of course, then you have something similar in China, for example, right? You will have in China a similar structure. Cluster of villages, one city of reference, another city, another cluster of villages. And bear in mind that we can even give to this an interpretation in terms of the time you need to move. Because if you walk to the market, you need to go, you basically walk and come back. You will walk to the market and go back to your original village within the day. That's the idea. This mustn't be very far away from where you live. Otherwise, it becomes very complex for you. In those instances in which you don't have the physical possibility of reaching the market and coming back within one day, usually there will be some specialized trader which basically brings to your home what you need. But no, let's stick to the standard situation. So, Europe, China, again to exemplify, and then with the opening of the Atlantic trade routes, something begins to move from this to this, and also, of course, then to the Chinese, to the Japanese world economy, to one of the many Indian world economies, and so forth and so on. And this creates an additional circle, which includes those. And originally, again, the amount of the product which moves to this distance is extremely limited. Maybe one part over 10,000 by as late as 1550. Now, you could say, okay, so these are very small numbers. Who cares about them? Well, you know, we care a lot about them because this is the opening of an opportunity. This is something which breaks barriers, which are economic barriers, but they're also psychological barriers. You know that something more is doable, and this, once it starts being put in place, continues to expand and expand and expand and expand until you reach basically a situation similar to that which the planet knows from the end of the 19th century, and which is, in terms of general levels of interconnectedness, not very different from what we experience today. And we will see that in the 20th century there are backs and forths from this ceiling, which we haven't exceeded yet. So we are in a situation, if you take everything together, which in terms of general interconnectedness of the different economic areas of the world is similar to what was achieved immediately before World War I, and we'll go back to this topic later. And then, of course, something happens, everything crumbles, and the level of interconnectedness of the global economy is significantly inferior later. You're welcome. Okay. Now, very importantly, there is no going back. That's the point. The path is traced from this moment on, and there is no going back. Now, we have introduced Braudel's take on this. So, world economy, world economies. And Braudel was already highlighting an important thing. In a world economy, there is an internal hierarchy, which you don't read here, of course, but there will be a center and a periphery, and if you want, areas which are kind of intermediate. Each world economy has its own internal hierarchy. So these are economic spaces which are hierarchically organized. Not everybody is on par, for example, from the point of view of trade. There will be areas which basically export raw materials or grain, and others which will export, I don't know, fine textiles or jewels, handicraft tools of high quality, and so forth and so on. There will be areas which produce grain, and there will be areas which produce iron, for example. And these will move towards a center which is more, which has a stronger manufacturing character, where something is produced that couldn't be easily produced anyplace else. This idea is then taken on by the so-called world system theory. And this is basically Immanuel Wallerstein, who builds upon Braudel to introduce this theory. So, Wallerstein talks about world systems with a trait plural and the movement towards a unified world system, global, in exactly the same way as Braudel does. In fact, Wallerstein takes this straight from Braudel. So this is kind of a sociological interpretation of what Braudel, the economic historian, argued for. And then Wallerstein, however, develops further the issue of hierarchy, in particular highlighting the fact that this hierarchy is unequal in terms of the exchanges which it establishes. And he also highlights the fact that this system will tend over time to keep the peripheries in their position of being periphery. So the working on the system itself will kind of lock in the situation to the advantage of the center, right? Now, you could represent this graphically in this way. You have a center or a core, a periphery, and then a semi-periphery. The periphery sells cheap labor and raw materials to the core and the semi-periphery, and the core will sell high-profit consumption goods and other stuff with high value added, with the semi-periphery basically being in an intermediate situation. Now, why this is relevant to our story? Well, the point is that when you have the opening of the closed words, when you have the beginning of the appearance of this big circle of economic exchange, which integrates what existed before, and then we begin with maybe 1 part over 10,000, then becomes 1 part over 5,000 over time, and it increases more and more and more as time progresses, still today, and again, with some back and forth during the last century and a half almost. Well, when that happens, this hierarchy is established at a global level. You remember what I was telling you last time. The pre-existing trade systems are integrated in the new Atlantic trade system, right? What existed in terms of exchanges across the Mediterranean Sea and between Mediterranean and Baltic existed in terms of exchanges between, within the Indian Ocean and also the Red Sea, and then in the Chinese seas and so forth and so on, is integrated in this broader system, to the point that I was making the case, in the case you have watched the video of the Japanese who basically take over the trade between China and Japan, profiting from a political situation in which the Chinese want to punish the Japanese because they are considered to be pirates and forbid them getting into their harbors. And then what you have, the Portuguese go to Japan, buy goods, and then are sold straight to China. And then everything becomes triangular because they use the revenue to acquire products, which then sent to Europe and so forth and so on. Okay. So the point is, you add an extra layer of complexity. But if you read this from Wallerstein's point of view, you can argue that this tends to establish another hierarchy, which has at its core what? Basically, to begin with, Western Europe. And this also is the origin of the process of progressive colonial expansion of the Europeans across the planet. Okay, now in the book by Pomerantz, you will find a critique of Wallerstein. You also will find a discussion of Wallerstein. So this is kind of a reference for you. So you can look at this into the book. But the point here is the following. World system theory highlights, gives a reading of long-run human history very much in terms of conquest and exploitation, right? These unequal trades keep the core in a core position, and everything in the end makes the advantages of those countries which are placed in the core. And it's very difficult for a country which is even just a semi-periphery to become part of the core. Well, there are a few examples. The most important one is maybe that of the United States, which go through a revolution, become independent, and relatively soon become part of the core of this global system. If you read the history with world system theory, right? Which is not to say that you should, but this is one way of looking at this, and one way which focuses on the nasty side of life, if you want. So this focuses on exploitation. This gives a very negative reading of the success of the West. Of course, if truly the rise of the West in terms of relative levels of development dates as far back as the beginning of the 16th century, which Pomerantz, by the way, doesn't believe is the case. He argues for the rise of one part of the West, so namely the northwest of Europe, so England, from not earlier than the middle of the 18th century, so much later than this. And we'll go back soon to Pomeranz interpretation. Now, why is it Europe which gives origin to this process? Okay, I'm checking that everybody is connected. Well, according to Wallerstein, this is because Europe had specific characteristics. So it had a bundle of characteristics, both institutional and economic, which made it particularly suited to this. Together, these have to do with the rise of capitalism, which, according to Wallerstein, is a tendency to continue search for ever increasing profits. This is how Wallerstein, and he takes this definition basically again, he models it upon the definition given by Brodel. This is what capitalism is for Wallerstein. And why this happens in Europe? Because in Europe there is, according to Wallerstein, again based on Brodel, a set of characteristics which include the presence of strong private property institutions, processes of commodification, which basically mean that goods are transformed into things which can be the object of trade. You have the rise of the modern sovereign state, which according to them wouldn't happen in the same way in other world areas, and so forth and so on. Now, as we will see later in the course, this kind of explanation, which basically argues that there was something specific to Europe institutional terms, can be challenged quite directly. So there are people who are strongly against this view, including, again, Pomeranz. Pomeranz is strongly against this interpretation of the reasons why the West, and in particular Western Europe, started to rise over other world areas. Now, I classify in general this definition as being both institutional and geopolitical, because the geopolitical side of the story is clear if you consider what this means in terms of direct dominion of certain world areas over other areas. Now, if you want to very quickly get at what this means in terms of expansion of empires, here you have the situation circa 1600. So basically, the European empires were the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire. Other European areas were just starting to build their empires. So this is kind of focusing on the most important thing. As you know, Spain and Portugal tried to divide the world into two big areas of influence with the Treaty of Tordesillas at the end of the 15th century, which basically established that Africa was a Portuguese area of influence, and Asia as well, while the Americas, bar for a small part of what is today Brazil, was meant to be an area where the Spanish would have expanded instead. Whatever the actual historical meaning of these treaties is, it's had some influence, but not as big over the long run as you might think. Still, it has an impact, for example, in the languages which are spoken in different areas of South America today, anyway. But the point is, the Spanish start trying to control relatively large areas of the inland, and this is because they basically conquer also empires. They conquer the Aztec Empire and they conquer the Inca Empire, as we remember from earlier lectures. So they had the possibility of taking over some sort of political organization of large territories. The Portuguese, well, in Africa, they were basically interested simply in controlling bases along the shores. They weren't trying in this period to control large territories in Africa. They only wanted to be sure that they had bases which would allow them to move from their Atlantic coast to India, basically, and then to China. Here we have an example, one of the forts built by the Portuguese in Africa. This is one fort in Ghana, built in 1482. And below, you have instead the Portuguese enclave in Goa, in India, and also in India, they don't try at all to conquer territories. They only want to be sure that they can get protection within the walls of Goa if something goes wrong with the locals, right? So they want to have protection, but they aren't trying to expand their direct control over the inland areas. So this is circa 1600. Well, of course, you know, it's not like the Portuguese don't do that and the Spanish do that because, well, because the Portuguese maybe are nicer guys and the Spanish, and they don't have empires to conquer. Well, no, there's also another problem here. It is that Portugal is very small. So Portugal suffers from a constraint to its ability to do stuff, which is its dimension, the size of its population. And the size of the population of both Portugal and Spain places a constraint on what they can achieve with their colonies. This is important because instead England goes around this problem in a very different way. England tries to expel population and sends a lot of people, especially to the Americas, for many reasons, and maybe this allowed England to constrain the negative consequences of Malthusian dynamics that, for example, for Pomerans, were what really might have constrained the long-run development of what were, in early modern times, the most advanced parts of the world. So we will see this soon, you know, in relative terms, looking at a comparison between England and China especially, but in general, the most advanced part of Western Europe and East Asia. Now, to conclude this part, so we are here, previous slide, at 1600. By 1750, you see that there are new players in this game, the Dutch, who have started to take over the Portuguese in their domains in Asia in particular, and the Dutch, at least in areas which were producing really high valuable goods, like for example the nutmeg or other spices, were trying to control directly the land. And then of course we have the English and the French, which expand in this phase, especially in North America, and then we have the continuation of the process of expansion of the Portuguese and the Spanish. By the second half of the 19th century, until the eve of World War I, we have a further expansion. We have Africa becoming a colonial domain of Italy, the vast majority of it, almost all of it. Also India becoming a British colony, and so forth and so on. But we could say more about the integration of Oceania in this process, etc. But the point is, look at this, and look at and consider who are the colonizers and who are the colonized, and then look at a recent interpretation of the hierarchy, the economic hierarchy of the world based on world system theory. So how is this made? They look at the conditions of trade between different world areas, and this is how you can end up classifying the world. And then you see that you have Europe at the core, plus the so-called European offshoots, which include United States, Canada, and then Australia and New Zealand as well. So areas which have a culture and institutions which are closely modeled upon those from Europe. And again, the United States are the first colony which acquires independence, right? And is able to become part of the core. And then you have the rest of the world divided between peripheries and semi-peripheries. Now, I always think this is kind of interesting to show in class. This is very interesting in terms of getting how you can provide an interpretation of this process which is pretty negative, right? In general, as we will see, you can move in between a pretty negative interpretation of the rise of the West in relative terms, which is this. So exploitation, colonial domination, the plight of the conquered people, and so forth and so on. Or, and you would move to the other extreme, what Pomerantz calls the European miracle theory, claim that the colonies weren't important at all, that the peripheries were peripheral. What mattered were processes which happened internally to the West, with the colonies basically being something that didn't affect this, which means, in this case, that you are saying, okay, the reason why the Europe rose from whatever period it rose, but all these interpretations argue that the beginning of the process relatively early, from at least the beginning of the 16th century, is that Europe had the best institutions, maybe the best cultural traits, it was good at doing something. Colonies, exploitation, yeah, it was there, it was bad, but that didn't matter in the big picture, okay? So a very positive interpretation, which of course I'm making very radical for you, just for the sake of discussion. In between these two, you can find different and more balanced positions. Actually, as we will see, Pomerantz, who criticizes both of them, argues that there were some characteristics of a part of Western Europe which made it eligible for the transition to an industrial society, but those characteristics were not only typical of this advanced part of Western Europe, but are to be found also in the most advanced part of China and in parts of Japan, and maybe in the most advanced part of India as well. What Europe had more was access to the boon of the colonies, so the extra resources which could be brought in from the colonies. And within Europe, you have Britain, as we will see, in an even more advantaged situation because Britain also had easy access to coal, which allowed to solve a problem with energy availability, which was, in all the other relatively advanced areas of the world, as we will see, a strong constraint on potential growth. Okay? Now, I will stop for a moment here. Do you have questions on this? Of course, you are welcome to ask questions whenever you want. Also, students from class.
Just to repeat the last point, so this view is negative in the sense that there were some reasons, maybe during the beginning of the 16th century, that explains why Europe became the core, maybe institutional reasons.
Yeah.
And then the process basically got separate force, but keep the position as a central one.
You're correct. In fact, also in this case, you have an argument about some relatively good characteristics of Europe originally, right? And then you have an edge, which, this is also important, I didn't tell you this. The advantage, in this view, the advantage that Europe might have had originally, so from before the colonial expansion, might have been very small, very small. Why? Because if you remember the graph of the interactions between center, periphery, and semi-periphery, when you have the beginning of the establishment of that hierarchy, the working of the system will automatically tend to increase the advantage of the core, and will automatically tend to push the peripheries from a peripheral towards a peripheral condition. Okay, so it's not like you need a huge advantage originally. You only need, there's something which leads you to get from Europe to China and not vice versa. And then the argument could be, okay, this is because the states were competing, they had a need for innovation. Then you had the strong interest in trade because everything was traded in their society, right? And then this leads them to see this opportunity to try and actively open this route, which is what the Portuguese do. That's, as we remember, a project which lasts from 1434 till 1498, when they actually managed to reach the Indies by India by circumnavigating Africa and so forth and so on. But that initial advantage, in this view, might have been extremely small, and then the system will tend to increase. Yes, and the system is intrinsically inegalitarian. And it's a system which, from the geopolitical point of view, requires subjugation of certain areas to others, economically and also increasingly politically. Now, so Niccolò Bargellini from Homs says, In the late 20th century, shouldn't we talk of a two-world system, the division in blocks after World War II? Absolutely, but this map is after the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1489, and then the crumbling of the communist bloc. What you say is very important, because when I say that the level of globalization measured in terms of interconnectedness between different world areas is not higher, looking at certain parameters, compared to the beginning of the 20th century, well, that is directly the consequence also of the Russian Revolution, and then after World War II of the expansion of the communist bloc. So when you have the world divided into two blocks, the Western bloc and the communist bloc, which basically trade very little, you have, if you measure in whatever way you want globalization, a huge drop in the level of interconnectedness at the global scale. You have two big blocks which are opposed, right? So in that sense, you are correct, but this map shows the situation at the very end of the 20th century. The article where I took it from is 2000. I don't know whether there is an updated map. I should check, actually, because of course then things change. But this was also a moment when, for example, Russia was in a relatively low position in terms of its relative GDP per capita and also the conditions of its trade. So, you know, maybe certain areas would look a little bit different, but the general picture in terms of having cores which are in the West, so in Europe, plus these offshoots of Europe, would not basically change. Yes? Could you please, I didn't hear you. Okay, so I will repeat the example of the United States in this sense. The United States, sorry, the North America, of course, starts as being periphery. When the Europeans arrive, they kind of colonize it. First the French, as you know, and then the English become more and more important. They acquire also physically a larger and larger part of the territory, okay? And then, of course, to the south, you have the Spanish and whatever. What is striking in the case of the United States is that with the American Revolution, they are the first colony which becomes independent after a war with the colonizer, with England. And then, very quickly, if you look at the expansion of American international trade, they are also able to become part of the core. Now, if you wanted to read American history from the point of view of war system, you might say that the revolution is against a system of trade which tries to keep what would become the United States in at most a condition of being a semi-periphery. Why a semi-periphery? Because, for example, the English were building already a lot of their ships directly in North America. So they were in a situation which was different from from areas from which you simply take raw materials and basic goods. But in that way, they managed to overcome this political constraint, and then they quickly managed to become part of the core. Similar story for the other European offshoots. But you had another question also, right?
The way the system works makes the core always be like the core, and the periphery become like become hard to the periphery, but to become part of the core. So how does this process of becoming like a semi-peripheral or core country happen?
How the process ends?
No, how it happens, because
okay, how it happens. Okay. Yeah. So for the students at home who maybe weren't able to hear you, your colleague in class has asked how this process, which kept the core and periphery happened. Okay. Well, for example, because you try and force the territories that you control directly not to produce goods that you want them to acquire from the motherland. which is actually what the English tried to do in India when India was part of their imperial domains. And we will maybe we will say something about India under the British, right? Later on in the second half of the course, basically. And then you see exactly what this means. They placed a lot of constraints on what, for example, local merchants could trade and with whom they could trade. They kind of forced the Indians to produce the kind of goods that they wanted for their own trading interest and so forth and so on. Another example of this kind, again, if I wanted to read history through war system, which is not necessarily what you would want to do, but that's one possibility, is to think about what happened between Britain and China at the time of the Opium Wars of the 19th century. China wants to stop importing drugs from the British, who wanted to sell them drugs because they wanted to balance the tea trade, right? So they wanted to buy tea in China, which was produced for the British market, but they didn't want to have a system of exchange where they were simply buying, because the Chinese, for a number of reasons, we get into that later, didn't want to buy a significant amount of other stuff in exchange from Britain. So what happened is that there was an outflux of silver from the British Empire to China. To balance this, they basically find one good which they can sell to the Chinese, which is opium. And they produce it in India, forcing the Indians to produce it, right? And then when the Chinese government says, okay, we don't want any more opium because this is going to create a huge problem in our population, and as we will see, the percentage of people addicted to opium in China in that period was becoming extremely large, they wage war, basically, to constrain China to take that from them. Okay, so also this is a way in which, I mean, in this case, you reach the point when you actually go to war. Otherwise, the point was to try and force an area which was a semi-periphery, right, China, to accept conditions of trade which in the end aren't advantageous to China, or at least are more advantageous to Britain, because China, apart from the economic balancing of the trade, was basically buying opium and selling tea. And from the point of view of public health, that makes for a difference, right? And so you can see these operating in many different ways. And you can read all the colonial wars in this way, in a sense. I mean, those happening, to actually control the territory, not those happening between colonial empires, which are driven by the interest of different parts of the core, if you want, right? Well, for example, you have colonial wars between England and the Dutch Republic and the Portuguese and the Spanish, which are connected to a process which is aimed at bringing the center of the center, so the core of the core, to North Europe, pushing the Southern Europe, in particular southwest of Europe, so the Iberian area, into a less prominent position, right? So all of this is core, but also within the core, if you look, more carefully, you will find internal hierarchies. And this is the story of the little divergence, which hopefully soon enough will start to tell. Okay, so this is the way in which this works. And it's not a game. I mean, trade by itself will tend to produce this. When there is resistance, you can also become violent. This is also a history of violence, of course. Exploitation, war, violence, local populations being treated poorly, obviously, and so forth and so on. So a very nasty, it's like focusing on the responsibilities also. I mean, this also leads you to focus on the possible responsibilities of the West towards other world areas. Because of course, if this is true, and I'm not telling you that this is true, but if this is true, it means that areas of the world which today are trying to catch up in terms of development might be placed today in those lower positions because of what the West did 3 centuries ago or 2 centuries ago, okay? So Also in terms of, international politics, you can easily see why sticking to this gives rise to leads to a whole range of debates and possible conclusions, which are very different from what would come from saying, no, the rise of the West has strictly to do with what the West was doing in the West. So development of the proto industry are, part of progress, which also includes technological advancement and blah, blah, blah. And the colonies never mattered much. And there were quite a few scholars who claimed these before Pomerantz. Some of them now had to admit that actually the colonies might have been more important to the rise of the West than they originally thought. For example, Patrick O'Brien, there is a link to a nice short interview that he gave in the slides. Again, we can't listen to this in class because it's complicated. All the video stuff is, difficult. And he actually, while reinforcing his idea, his view, restating his view that in the end what mattered were the local developments, and we'll get there soon, also says, but I admit that reconsidering, colonies were maybe more important to the core, so to England in particular, than I previously thought. Okay, but we'll go back to the debate soon enough. Now, I already mentioned the fact that Pomerantz criticizes this view, and it criticizes this view basically because he argues that the similarities between the most advanced parts of the world, both in the West and the East, are what we should actually focus on. The other important criticism is that he says Wallerstein, and before him Brodel, because you wouldn't have Wallerstein without Brodel, basically, they are focusing too much on the top, on international trade. But we're talking about very few people. And remember, Chanou, a limited amount of goods for a long time. By 1550, one part over 10,000 of the product, maybe. Okay? So, this is maybe an issue, something which has to do with the interest that historians had for these great merchants, whom we happen to know about, also because they left documents, right? So we know a lot of example about these merchant from Prato, Francesco di Marco d'Atini, who is actually a survivor of the Black Death, so somebody who survived the Black Death in the 14th century. Why? Because at the beginning of the 20th century, in his palace, which still exists today in the city of Prato in Tuscany, below a staircase, they realized that beyond a wall, the wall had been added later, and beyond that wall, there was basically his entire personal archive. Thousands and thousands of letters of trade with whatever other parts of Europe you want to think about, because this was one of the big players in the international trade of his age. So, think about the 1980s, right? We knew a lot about these people because we had a lot of information about at least some of them. We didn't know as much about the poor guy who lived in a rural village in the southern Tuscany Maremma area, for example. We knew everything about Francesco di Marco d'Atini. We have his personal exchanges with, you know everything about his family life because he was writing with his friends, his wife, he was in Bruges and whatever, and she was asking whatever he was doing in Bruges with some suspect also. It's a very fascinating story. There is also a very nice book, which is a very nice read, which is in English, it's The Merchant of Prato. You can find it in Bocconi Library. It's very nice, fascinating read. And in Italian, it's Mercante di Prato, so it's whatever language you want. Anyway, the point is, maybe we have been distracted by looking at this top of the pyramid. If we look beyond that, similarities are what should be highlighted for Pomerantz. And then another part of the criticism, as we will see, is whether really we can think that those features of Europe were unique to Europe, those features that Wallerstein and also Brodel were kind of highlighting. For Pomerantz, what we need to highlight is instead the similarities, again, however, not between the wall of the West, so the wall of Western Europe and the wall of Eastern Asia. No, between the most advanced parts of both Western Europe and East Asia. Also very important. Now, given this, if this is true, then what's different? If the basics of the economic and social even organization of these very advanced world areas were different, why is it Europe which establishes an edge even late, so after 1750, over the other areas of the world? Well, and in particular Northwestern Europe. Well, in this story then, exploitation of the colonies becomes significant for him, because this allows to overcome constraints that all these very advanced parts of the world were going to face. So the point is not that there wasn't something good. So the point is not that there wasn't anything good happening in Western Europe. There was. The point for Pomerantz is similar processes, however, were taking place also in the Yangtze Delta in China, so the most advanced part of China, also in the most advanced parts of Japan, and maybe in parts of India. Although India, for him, was not still facing the kind of constraints which might have led it to try and force those very constraints, okay? So different areas moving along the same path, and then one manages to overcome these constraints to become the first industrial area of the world, and when that happens, and only when that happens for Pomerantz, to start experiencing, enjoying an edge in terms of relative levels of development compared to the other advanced parts of the world. So again, you remember for Pomerantz, the Great Divergence begins late, not early than 1750, and then more clearly from the 19th century. A late process. Now, about the European miracle theory, I have already started discussing you with this. It's not the wall of the West, it's a specific part of the West, not the wall of Europe, but a specific part of Western Europe. And then we already discussed the issue with his criticism of the so-called European miracle idea. As Patrick O'Brien said, for the economic growth of the core, the periphery was peripheral. So that's Patrick O'Brien's answer to world system theory, a direct challenge to that. And Pomerantz, who is critical of world system theory, is also critical of the European miracle view, because he argues that the colonies were important. So there is also this story of exploitation which contributes to explain the rise of the West for Pomerantz. But it's not the whole story. It's also a story of internal developments. But, again, those internal developments were not unique to Europe and didn't even involve the whole of Europe. And again, certain aspects of this story we will discuss later. Now, what's the problem here? The problem is that if you remember the law of diminishing returns in the context of an agrarian society, pre-industrial agrarian society, the problem is the following. If you have an increase in population, and if you have a constraint on the amount of land available, then at a certain point, the law of diminishing returns will kick in. For example, because you will not have good lands to add to the plots, to the areas which are cultivated, because you will simply be able to add extra workers to the same plots. They are going to produce a little bit more, but with diminishing returns. Now, the point is the following. For Pomerance, what you need in order to have a transition towards an industrial economy is first population growth. Why? Because you need to have workers able to move from the rural to the industrial sector. So you need to have a production of human beings. At the same time, however, you need them to be able to consume the products from the industry. So you also want to be able to have rising per capita consumption. They need to diversify their consumption. You need to be able to buy stuff which they weren't using before. And that's the stuff produced by the factories, for example, and in greater and greater quantities. And then, of course, you want, automatically, if you are thinking about industrialization, to have a larger and larger part of the population working in the industry. The point is that for Pomerance, the most advanced parts of the world in the 18th century were all, and then we're talking both about some parts of Western Europe, including England, and Yangtze Delta and parts of Japan, and so forth and so on, all of them were running straight into a cul-de-sac, so a street without an exit, a road without an exit. Why? Because you can't do these three things together. You can't expand your population without experiencing, because of the low diminishing returns, a decline in the per capita consumption. And you can't increase the specialization in industry, because otherwise you are killing your people. Because if you need all the workforce working the land in order to produce basic foodstuff, you can think that many more will move from rural to industrial activities, right? And this says this is the constraint that all these areas were facing. Now, when you think about constraints, you should remember what we were saying at the very beginning of the course about the Neolithic revolution, right? Cohen, the alternative view. Being exposed to a constraint can trigger change. The very fact, in certain conditions, the very fact that a process of change begins comes from the fact of having almost reached a point beyond which you can't go. So you need to do something different. Very good. These constraints must be felt. And this is, by the way, why, for Pomerance, India probably wasn't in the same condition, because India, due to these internal developments, wasn't going to face those constraints soon. So probably it wasn't still kind of ready to effect this transition, even if it could have had the means to do that, which for Pomerance it couldn't, for reasons that will become clear now. In demographic terms, the point is that of maximum carrying capacity. So, let me take a picture of this, and then I will clean a part of the board, okay? Take a picture, because I know that from home it's difficult to read the board in the video. So do you think that this way of sharing the contents works? Also people at home? I mean, this is very low tech, but in my limited experience, low tech. In the case of these hybrid courses, is the best solution. So also from home, okay, it works. Okay, so we'll continue to do exactly this, and I commit to upload the pictures as soon as I can. Now, maximum carrying capacity. Let me make you an example. Time here, population on the Y axis. Italian population from year 0 till say year 1800. You have Roman Empire and fall, growth, Black Death. Then growth. And then only from 1700. This. I drew this poorly. I think that by now in this course you have realized that my drawing skills are somehow constrained. And I want this to be more like this. Okay. So this is the wall of Italy, Italian population, okay, wall of Italy thing. And here you have a nice ceiling that, as far as we know, was reached at the time of the Roman Empire, was reached again at the beginning of the 14th century, was reached again at the beginning of the 17th century. Then, if you take only the north or the south, you would have a drop, which are the peaks in 1613, 1656. We'll talk about them later in the course. So the average is flattish, and then only from circa 1700, you have the moment when you finally overcome these constraints for reasons which I will not explain and basically have to do with the spread of the cultivation of maize and rice across Italy. So it's the crops from the New World. But this is interpreted usually as the maximum carrying capacity of the Italian demographic system before the 18th century, meaning this is the maximum population which could be fed in Italy, in the Italian peninsula. Okay? So the point is the following. In order to have the stimulus to get beyond the agrarian system, you need to feel the pressure of population. So you need to be close to the maximum carrying capacity. You need to be a population almost as large as it could be. Why I say almost? Because if the population exceeds the maximum carrying capacity, then you will have what Malthus called the positive checks kicking in, meaning famines, plagues, whatever, killing people and bringing population back. You have here the fall of the Roman Empire, possibly triggered by the Antonine Plague, which was smallpox, by the way. Here you have the Black Death. Here you have the stop, which is connected to the 17th century plagues. So it's not, I mean, the timing is pretty interesting. I wouldn't sell you one single reading of this whole story, but the idea is, if you take Malthus, that you can give a Malthusian interpretation of this, right? But the point is, the concept you're interested in is this. Maximum carrying capacity means being close to the maximum you can sustain in that territory with that kind of technology, availability of crops, and so forth and so on. And this is just an example for Italy. The case of Italy fits pretty well this general picture. So the problem with North India is that it wasn't close, probably, as far as we know, to the maximum carrying capacity of its system. So it wasn't feeling the pressure, meaning by the middle of the 18th century, it wasn't a competitor. We have instead Japan, parts of India, parts of Japan, parts of India, and parts of Europe in particular, as we will see, England. So we already have seen this. We will also develop additional aspects later. I'll be quick on some slides, but I already discussed this, and you also have the book by Pomerantz to go into greater details about this. Now, we have some evidence that these constraints were kicking in because we have a lot of evidence about increases in food scarcity, but also deforestation, erosion of lands in all these very advanced areas. What this means? It means that the population pressure was inducing to make an ever stronger and more intense exploitation of the natural resources, which was on the verge of becoming overexploitation, which would have led to an environmental disaster possibly. This is exactly what, for Pomeranz, England was going to face, notwithstanding the fact that England had the advantage of being able to expel parts of the population to the New World, so to the Americas, which allowed to kind of slow down this process. The different areas had some relative comparative advantages. For example, Europe had some additional problems compared to Asia regarding the fiber crops, so the crops which you need to produce textiles, like hemp, cotton in particular, and so forth and so on. But the point is, we have evidence that all these areas were experiencing the same problems. Wood is also a particularly important good in this perspective, because wood is needed for heating. So heating, so keeping warm, remaining well fed, these are the basic necessities. So you need wood, you need clothes, you need food. The Malthusian subsistence is that. But you need wood for heating, generally speaking, in this moment in history. And what's the problem with wood? Well, in this context, the problem with wood is that you also need wood for a bunch of other things. But if you need more wood to keep a larger and growing population warm, and at the same time you need wood because it's needed by your nascent industry, then you have a problem, because you will not have in your territory enough forests and woods to cut to produce that wood, okay? And wood is renewable, but only slowly. And we have historical evidence, looking, for example, at the progressive decline of the size of forests in all these areas, that wood was becoming an increasingly severe problem. And we have also other evidence, for example, a sharp increase in the price of wood used for fuel in France, where it doubles in between 1726 and 1789. Then what happens in 1789 in France? The French Revolution. According to certain interpretations, this kind of dynamic, so the growing cost of life, and also, if you want, the growing economic inequality in France, might have contributed to trigger the French Revolution. Then others would argue this was basically an issue with, this was basically a development which has political roots. And I could talk you more about that, but the fact that there is a doubling in the price of wood used for fuel in the 18th century before the revolution kind of, show that maybe there were processes in the French economy in that moment which might have created a fertile ground for a large-scale political upheaval, right? Because of course, if the price of wood doubles, the population is not going to be happy. Think about what's happening today in Europe with the price of energy, right? I don't know whether I was at a restaurant today, and the guy who I was paying for my meal was kind of complaining that they were paying double the bill for energy compared to last year, for example. Wasn't happy, right? Think about this generalized unhappiness over decades, and this mounting and mounting and mounting, and no solution coming, by the way, because no solution was coming in this context for Pomeranz, okay? No solution was coming, not precisely, if you had only your physical territory available. Now, just to show some evidence, here you have the hectares of, so let's look at the percent of forest in some advanced parts of China, and you see the decline pretty much everywhere from the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century. For example, in the Guangdong, the percentage of land which was forest falls from 45% to 24%. Again, with significant increases in the price of wood. And if you want to think about the impact, the constraint that this placed on the transition to an industrial system, this is the Lingnan, if I remember correctly. And if you consider the whole forest which was available at different dates. And then you calculate how much of that was needed to keep people warm. And then you look at the residual, you see that what wood, in terms of tons per capita, which was available for whatever wasn't heating, was falling very quickly and quite dramatically, meaning that for construction works, for industry, for building ships, wood was becoming ever scarcer. And you can't force your people to die of cold during the winter. I mean, you can try and do that, then you have a revolution, basically. Or at least a revolt, one of those nice popular revolts, which are a feature of pre-industrial societies whenever the political system is taught to kind of actively place the people in a situation in which they risk dying. Not because something happens and everybody dies, like, I don't know, hailstorms destroy the crops for 3 years in a row. That's a fact of life. The people revolt when they think that those in power are not doing what they could to help them or have engineered the crisis somehow. Okay? So if you know that there is wood and you are dying of cold, that's when you revolt. Not because there isn't food any place, because the crops have been destroyed everywhere. You know that, you suffer, but it's not like you will also revolt. This is really something important to understand about pre-industrial societies, right? And how they could relatively stable bar for periods of extreme violence. And maybe we'll be able to say something about this later in the course, because this also has to do with our study of inequality, of course. And then, if you look at the cost, I mean, the consequence of all this is that the cost of wood for example, building ships in China rises by 700%, so by 8 times, between 1550 and 1820, which is quite significant. And this, for Pomeranz, is again the sign of the fact that the constraints were really kicking in. What's then the advantage of Britain? I'll be quick about this and then we'll go back to this tomorrow, because I also want to talk to you about the descriptive report. What was the advantage of Britain? Well, Britain had the colonies. So for example, they could build their ships directly in North America, what we were saying before, which of course was helping the local economy of the British colonies in North America, which is why they were basically semi-peripheries before the revolution, growing into semi-peripheries, so they had opportunities which other colonies didn't have. And the second advantage that Britain had was easy access to coal. Why that's an advantage? Because coal is, cheap coal solves the problem of heating, which in other places has to be solved by using wood, firewood. Okay? And this is specific, so the easy availability of coal is specific to Britain in the context of Western Europe. So it's not Western Europe. It's one of the most advanced parts of Western Europe, which had 2 specific advantages. One was access to the colonies, which also the French had, by the way, but they also had the other one, which was easy access to cheap coal. For Pomeranz, together, this is what allows Britain, when it was faced with these constraints that everybody were, not everybody, but that all these advanced areas were going to meet as they developed, it allows Britain, and only Britain, to overcome them and for the first time move towards an industrial economy. For Pomeranz, this couldn't have happened without pressure on resources, being very advanced, and having these 2 specific advantages. None of them characterized, for example, the Yangtze Delta. And tomorrow, we will resume from the following slide, which is an excerpt straight from Pomeranz. Do you have questions about this? Questions from home? So, while you think about whether you have questions, I will upload the other file I wanted to show you today, which has to do with the descriptive report. To stop sharing this. Okay, I think it's this one. And as I said, the material that I will show you now is already in the Blackboard space in a specific folder called, labeled with little fantasy or little imagination, descriptive report. Why can't I? Okay, I want to show you. Okay. Now, first of all, let me reiterate that this is optional. So, what does this mean? Very simply, it means that there are some very specific rules to this game. If you don't like the rules, you don't play the game. What's the impact on your final evaluation? Potentially nothing, because the way in which the exam, the course is structured, allows everybody to get the top mark, so 30 with laude, or 31 for the purposes of the usual calculations at Bocconi, without doing this. So again, you do this if you want to do this. There are some constraints in this game which are placed on purpose, because a few years ago we have started discussing, and there was a program director back then, the issue of soft skills. Which are the soft skills that students here might need and develop? Well, for example, teamwork, presentation in class, and this will do with the group work at the end of the course, or I think also writing very short text in a very effective way on broad topics. Now, you might think that in your academic career, and more importantly, maybe in your future work career, you need to be able to write, text independently from their length. But in practice, usually, what is required from you is synthesis. So you need to be able to write good short text. And this is what we do with this. This is also part of what we do with this descriptive report. Now, what do you have to do? Well, first you have to select an area of the word and provide a report on the history of that area of the word in the perspective of the grid divergence over a long period of time. You have to do this within a maximum of 2 pages. So this must be short. We are evaluating only quality here and not quantity. When I say a word area over a long period of time, I mean at least from 1500, or earlier if you want, up until circa the middle of the 19th century. So it's very broad what you have to cover, right? In 2 pages. So every word matters. That's the point. Every word matters. And again, the constraints here are rigid, so it's not negotiable. You'll get 2 pages dot. Not like, yeah, but I do a particularly interesting area, I have plenty of stuff to write, can I get an extra page? No. No negotiation of that kind. Now, why no negotiation? Because it might happen to you, as it happened to me, of being basically forced by the rules of the game to stick to specific lengths. The form that I will ask you to use for writing the project, I modified from the forms which you have to use if you want to apply for European research grants, which are basically the most prestigious research grants you can ask in Europe to basically any funding body, right? And the point is, you live or die based on your project, but especially based on the short version of the project. Yeah? You got two versions, a long one and a short one. I'm sure that the long one, is not what matters. What matters is the short one. If you don't convince in the short one, the long one will never be read. And I'm not even sure that the long one will ever be read independently from that, but that's another matter. So that's the short one, and you have to stick to those constraints, which of course I made a little bit harder yet, to make things more interesting. So what is evaluated in this descriptive report is the text which you submit to me at the latest by March 19, and this is an individual work. By March 19 means by the midnight of March 19, to me personally by email, which I think is the easiest thing you can do. Okay. Then, in class, on March 21, a happy few will be randomly selected in class, among, of course, those who have submitted the report, to present that in class. Now, this means that everybody needs to be able to present, to be ready to present. I say in class, but this course is hybrid, so people who can't be physically in class can do this, and they might then have to present these from remote. Okay. The point is, if you are selected and you aren't available physically, which I think is the ideal solution, or from remote, you don't get any points. Okay. The presentation is not evaluated, of course, because only, I said, a very few extremely lucky individuals will have this pleasure, right? But still, you must be ready to do that. And the presentation must be short, maximum 7 minutes, which is a lot, by the way, by international standards. I have been asked repeatedly to do stuff in 4 minutes. Maximum 7 minutes means you need to check the time and to prepare for that with a nice watch in front of you. It's not easy, so you need to be ready for that. Now, the presentation doesn't matter for the mark. The only way in which it matters is, okay, I call your name, you aren't here, you aren't at home connected. Sorry, unless, of course, emergencies, which sporadically happen, which have to be demonstrated, you need to be able to present. The project is evaluated on a scale which goes from 0 to 1, and it's also possible to get 0.5. These points go on top of your final mark. What does this mean? That if you have, I don't know, as the final average mark for this course, 29, and you get 1, you move to 30. If you're 29, you get 0.5, I will generously move your mark to 30. If you're at 29.5 and you get 0.5, it's still 30 in both cases. You might dislike this. I think this might be fun to do, by the way. So this might be an additional incentive if you're interested in these things. But still, there is a real possibility that this doesn't affect your mark at all, even if you do a good report. You might even be in the condition in which you get already 31 points from the exam and you have another point to add, but it's not like you can go beyond 31. Okay, so also in that case, this won't matter. Maybe you will have learned something, however. So in terms of experience, this will be very enriching, of course, but in terms of your mark, it might end up not mattering at all. Now, as I said, I will show you the form if we have time. You have to use a specific form, which is already in the Blackboard space. This form tells you a number of basic things, like the font you need to use, the size of the font, right? And also that you need to place your name in the specific places. And this is a problem. This has been a problem in the past with students using the Mac, because this part of the form wasn't converted properly. So you have only also a PDF there, which shows you how this should look. If you have doubts about that, ask. Those using a PC will simply have to use the Word form which I have uploaded, and then just remember to fill in all the little bits. And this information, sorry, about the font and whatever, is in the form. Now, the fact of respecting these basic simple rules is part of the exercise. So this must be done to the letter. So, this is a game also about being totally precise in respecting the rules of the game. And here you have some additional clarifications, as the rules of the game here are important, and as if you are 15 minutes late in submitting a research project for funding to the European Union, you will not get considered, right? Also, in this case, remember, you need to submit the project by, as I said, I don't remember now, March 19, midnight of March 19, okay? Which basically gives me the bare minimum for giving a look at the reports. Okay, now, as I was telling you, you get from 0 to 1 points for this. Okay, I'll go back to this slide. You get from 0 to 1 point for this, and there are two things which are evaluated. First is the quality of the text. So does the text convey a convincing description of the long-term development of this world area in the period considered? By the way, by a convincing description, I don't mean a totally exhaustive description. So you have little space. You must be convincing. You must tell a story which is a proper story, but you needn't to include all possible variants upon that story or alternative views about the development of that world area. This is also an exercise in selection. So you need to tell a story. It's not like you need to demonstrate you know everything. And that must be a coherent story. The other half of the evaluation has to do with the quality of the text, looking at the English. So this must be perfect English. And the text must be organized in a perfect way. So it must be a coherent and logical text, focused on the fundamentals. And you will not have more space for anything more than the fundamentals, because that's a 2 pages exercise. Now, what do I mean by a descriptive report? Well, first, you don't need to do any empirical analysis. Whatever you mean by that. So no econometrics, you don't even need to provide quantitative information. You might, but it's not a requirement. No analysis, it's a description. You need to tell a convincing story about the development of that area of the world in the long run, in the perspective of the great divergence. So, for example, you might want to look at its position compared to the rest of the world in relative terms, in terms of, even politics, geopolitics, whatever. For example, you have to look at what is proper for the world region that you decide to work on. And what is the kind of region you need to work on? Well, this could be a state. It could be a large region, like, Catalonia in Spain. You could do Spain, or you could do only Catalonia or Aragon, for example. You could do Italy, or you could do the Republic of Venice only. You could do the region Lombardy in Italy, or the state of Milan, which basically coincides with the region of Lombardy. In other cases, it's different. You could do the Kingdom of Naples, or you could do the region of Apulia. A region, a large administrative region in a modern state is fine. The Elbe Island, or the city of Bergamo, or the city of, I don't know, La Rochelle, no. You can do Normandy if you want. You can do the Kingdom of France. You can do one city in the Kingdom of France. If you're in doubt about the scale, ask me after class or send me an email. In general, for those who are physically present in class, ask me after the end of class if you want to do this. For those who can't attend physically class, send me an email or come to my meetings, to my office hours, as you prefer. Again, the specific perspective is that of globalization and divergence, so it's our perspective. By the end of the first part of the term, this will be more clear to you because we'll have completed our work on the great divergence and also the little divergence, so North Europe versus South Europe. And what do I mean by a descriptive and very short report? Well, first of all, you shouldn't express, you shouldn't present anything as your personal opinion. You have to write a relatively dry text, right? In the sense you describe something, at least in terms of how you write that, without making any judgment. Now, you might think that this means that you aren't making any judgment. No, simply you aren't making any judgment in Brit. Where is the judgment that you make? It's in what you include. Now, by the end of this course, usually it's very clear that there are different ways of looking at history, and that's obvious, right? We fight, between scholars, between historians, we always fight about whatever, basically, surely about the causes and the timing and the interpretation of divergence, for example. But more importantly than that, it will be clear to you by the end of this course that you can write history in a very different way, even for specific purposes. If you wanted to support, for example, a certain political platform through a certain reading of the history of a country, you can do that. This doesn't mean that you should do that. I surely wouldn't encourage you to do that. The important thing in this course, however, is simply that you are aware of the fact that what you decide to tell is not neutral. The way in which you tell that can be more or less personal. In this case, you have to present whatever you want to say as if that was the history. So it needs to be very dry, very focused, clear-cut, logical, coherent. And then, of course, between different takes on the history of part of the world, you could choose one. Okay? Think about, I don't know, telling a story of, I don't know, England by focusing on its past as an imperial power, or stressing more, again, the internal development. So, the variation between war system and European miracle. You could position yourself wherever you want. And that is not subject to my judgment at all. It's not like, you need to write what you think I believe in. No. Simply, the text must be coherent. Do you have questions about this? We can talk more about this if you want. Think about a question if you have one, and I will simply very quickly show you the form, and then I think we are over time already. And it should be this one. You have questions? Yes, one question there.
If you have to present you also have to make some presentation in PDF or something like that, or it's just a presentation by voice without anything?
Yeah, so usually my advice is to use the following. Having very difficult to read, I fear, sorry. How can I enlarge this? Oh, there is this handy tool here. Okay, oh, wow, I don't think we had these buttons before, but. So your colleague in class was asking whether at the moment of your presentation you need to have, I don't know, a PowerPoint or simply describe what you do and whatever. If you are in class, I strongly recommend you to prepare a PowerPoint because that makes your life easier. It's not a requirement, however. If you are at home, same story. I need to experiment exactly how I can make you share the screen. That's another matter. So be also prepared to simply tell the story, right? with or without the PowerPoint. But in general, yes, a PowerPoint would be helpful to you, which is not evaluated, by the way. While at the end of the course, the presentation of the group projects is evaluated on its own based on whatever you present. So what you say, how you organize that, PowerPoint if you have one, and so forth and so on. But in this case, no, it's only a yes or no. Was the student there to present? Yes, okay, so it's evaluated. So she or he is evaluated. Okay. Now this is the form. You see that there is a reference, specific reference to the Carter. The part which wasn't visible 2 years ago or 3 years ago to students using a Mac is the top. So you also have to place your name in the upper left corner and the country studied in the upper right corner. Now, you might think this is stupid, but I reiterate, in this game, we also evaluate whether the rules of the game have been respected. So in this case, you must be extremely precise. There are a few rules, not many. In the document which I just showed you, there is additional information. For example, can I include one table? On principle, you can, but that's part of the space you have. So you do that if it's worth it. Usually, students don't do that because usually, no. But in some cases, it might be helpful because it might actually save you space, one table or one graph. Maximum one, however, you'll find this clarified. Sorry, we are over time, but if you want, I'm available to answer additional questions. And if you have to hurry because you need to take a train or whatever, feel free to go. And we can also discuss this more if you have questions tomorrow or next week. So are there other questions in class or from home on this?
I have one of the sources. Like
Sorry?
the sources that we can use for the report. Like
the sources that you can use for the report. So you have to use at least 3 different sources, which can't include Wikipedia, which is not a reliable source. We developed specifically for the purposes of the group work at the end, a database of the books available at Bocconi Library divided by word area, right? And I might, in fact, upload that. I mean, we are updating that now. I'll upload that before. So you could use that as a starting point. Again, you need to have at least 3 sources, but it's not like I require you to have 300, right? 3 is the minimum because it shouldn't be an abstract from one reading. But again, the nature of this exercise is not for you to develop a totally exhaustive knowledge of that specific country in the world. And so, of course, you can. I'm happy if you do that, but that's not a requirement. So at least 3 different sources. And if you want my help or the research assistant help, you can also ask. I think that by the beginning of next week, I'll upload this database. And these are also all books which are physically available here, or you can access from the electronic resources. And of course, I mean, actually, these are those which are physically available. Then probably you have more and more by means of electronic resources, but you need to look at them on your own. Okay. So that's it. See you tomorrow. Remember to record your attendance if you haven't. Probably you can't anymore because we're over time anyway. Remember to do that every time. Okay, I will stop recording now and I will see you all tomorrow.